Welcome to the webinar of the WVS survey today. The topic of today is the elite citizen gap in international organization legitimacy. Welcome to the webinar series of the WVS Survey Association. We have these sessions every month, and we invite scholars from various disciplines who are utilizing WVS survey data either alone or in combination with other data sets to share their latest findings and insights. In today's webinar, our guest speakers, Jan Scholte from Leiden University and Schottgen Verhagen from Maastricht University, will explore the elite citizen gap in confidence towards international organizations using data from the WVS survey Wave 7, which they supported financially and scientifically, and a parallel elite survey. The presentation offers insights into how legitimacy is perceived differently across social groups and what this means for the future of global governance. Jan Scholte is Professor of Global Transformation and Governance Challenges at Leiden University. His interests cover various aspects of governing a global world, including polycentrism, multi-stakeholder institutions, and both empirical and normative legitimacy. Schottgen Verhagen is Assistant Professor of European Politics at Maastricht University. Her research inquires questions about how citizens relate to governing institutions at the local, regional, national, European, and global level, many levels. Currently, Schottgen is co-PI of the project called GlobePol, together with Virginie van Ingelgom on globalization, politics, and multi-level legitimacy. She's also part of the Ensured Horizon Consortium, which is studying transformations of global governance. Please, the floor is yours. Start your presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. One thing Schottgen and I didn't do was coordinate who was going to say the first words. So I'll say hello and say that this is as Christian. Thank you for the introduction. Carlos, I don't know if you are a small audience or if there are other people hidden behind you somewhere. But I'm inclined to say if it's a small group, I would almost say feel free to ask or make comments as we go along, and it might be more interactive. Otherwise, you are sitting listening to us for a long time, and maybe we are saying things that are uninteresting or boring or whatever. And we'll get to the end somehow, I think. Is that okay, Schottgen, also?
Thank you.
Yeah. So let's go. So this is a book that was published indeed 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, based on work that we did in the so-called Legitimacy and Global Governance Project, LegGov, based at the University of Stockholm. And both Schottgen and I at the time were based in Sweden. We've now moved to the Netherlands. But what we're going to do here is talk you through a little bit the inspiration for the work, why we think legitimacy is important, why it's important in relation to multilateral institutions in particular. We'll run you through some theory about how we think about legitimacy and where its sources lie. And then we have both descriptive data on what you will see is a significant average gap between citizen and elite legitimacy beliefs towards global governance, and as well some suggested explanations, particularly looking at individual level circumstances. So that's where we're going. Shall we do the first slide? If Schottgen, in your control of that. So in some. Probably to this audience, it doesn't need any justification, but we're in a world of very, very significant growing global policy challenges, health, migration, financial markets, war, climate change, digital, and more. Next slide. But although the global policy problems are growing, multilateralism as the conventional global governance approach has stalled, particularly since 2010. So in another study that I've done with Jonas and others from the LegGov, we established that really since in the last 15 years, there are no new significant intergovernmental organizations. There's little expansion or deepening of mandates. There are some prominent withdrawals of membership, currently ongoing, of course. The institutional mechanisms that multilateral bodies have are becoming less enabling in terms of making decisions and implementing them. Material resources, certainly in relative terms, are going down. Apart from the WHO and the COVID, you could say the visibility of multilateral institutions on the whole is receding. And even the norms and narrative of the liberal international order, which have underpinned multilateral institutions as we've known them, that narrative is under siege. So overall, growing global problems, the multilateral response under very great strain. That takes us to the question of legitimacy then. How much legitimacy do multilateral institutions attract? If you read the newspapers, you'd think that they don't attract any. But there's need to have good empirical evidence for that, so that's what we've looked at. We also see that in the current context of considerable populism and anti-globalism, a suggestion that somehow elites might be out of touch with the general public when it comes to global connections, global cooperation, global policy. So this project also has, in a sense, tested what and whether there are different general levels of legitimacy towards multilateralism between elites on the one hand and the general public on the other. And we'll get into what we mean by elites and so on in a moment. And if there is a gap, which, as I say, we will show there is, how can one explain that gap? And we will in particular look at a gap as it relates to individual level factors rather than the more common approach of looking at institutional input-output type of analysis. Again, we'll explain more what we mean by that. Legitimacy, the concept, just to put that into perspective, we take legitimacy to be the belief and perception that a governing power has the right to rule and exercises that rule appropriately. That's how we understand the concept of legitimacy generically. Specifically, when we look at multilateral institutions, legitimacy is about believing that multilateral institutions have the right to formulate and administer rules for global policy problems. Maybe underline here too that we're thinking about legitimacy as an underlying faith and a deeper approval of a governance arrangement. We're not talking about generic support for, or more specific support for particular measures or particular leaders that might be attached to a multilateral institution. No, we're looking at the underlying faith in the regime. And here also to note, we are empirical political scientists here. We're not normative political theorists. So we're not making judgments about what people should think in terms of the criteria of legitimacy. We're asking how much legitimacy do we observe in populations that are affected by multilateral institutions. Briefly, why do we bother with legitimacy? It's often believed, and various studies, including several that I've been involved in, have demonstrated that legitimacy can help a governor, or in this case, multilateral institutions, international organizations. Legitimacy can help to acquire mandates, to obtain resources, to attract participation, to allow the multilateral institutions to take decisions, to implement those decisions, get compliance with the policies that they've put out. And if you get all of that, then you're more able to achieve your goals, more able to advance the problem solving that you've been set up to do. So legitimacy is a major resource in that regard for working multilateral institutions. Also, if you're more legitimate, then in the competition between institutions, more legitimacy can help you to stand out. And I've certainly seen that in the internet sphere where I do other work. So legitimacy is not necessarily the only thing that allows a multilateral institution to make a difference, but it's certainly a major thing that does. All right, we've looked at multilateral institutions. We are focusing on intergovernmental organizations, not global governance as a whole. And we've looked specifically at the International Criminal Court, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and the World Trade Organization. Why did we look at these 6? They cover a number of different issue areas. All of them have worldwide membership. They also are relatively known and visible, because it's hard to measure and explain legitimacy beliefs that don't exist. I mean, you can't have a legitimacy belief towards something that you don't, of which existence you don't know. So we did have to have multilateral institutions that would be known and visible, particularly to the general public. And also these institutions at various times and ways have attracted considerable contestation, which makes them also interesting to look at from a legitimacy perspective. I read yesterday that the Trump administration considers withdrawing from the IMF and the World Bank, which I thought that must be one of history's greatest own goals. But anyway. All right, there's variation in the issue area, there's variation in the institutional structures and procedures, the variation in the degree of authority that these institutions have, and there's variation in the degree of policy impact that they have. So that's why we took these 6. And then we also looked at countries in particular. We'd used data from the World Values Survey across all of its 80 or so countries that were in the 7th wave. But for the elite survey, we could not do the same amount, so we decided to focus on 5 countries. In fact, we looked at 6, but the World Value Survey in the end didn't roll out in South Africa as it was planned, so we had to drop the comparison in relation to South Africa, hence no African country in this selection. But otherwise, Brazil, Germany, Philippines, Russia, and USA. You see a diversity of world regions, a diversity of geopolitical positions, economic conditions, political regimes, and also different experiences of the multilateral institutions that we look at. So we thought there's a nice variety across these countries. And as we mentioned to Christian just before we went on air, we actually found that the results collectively for these 5 countries that we focused on very much parallel the averages for the 80 countries as a whole. So whether by intention or not, we have a nice small sample that seems to reflect the overall coverage, which is nice. There's a number. I think I better stop talking.
Yes. So first, I will tell you something about the data that we used, and I will describe some levels of confidence, so which is our measure for legitimacy beliefs in the different countries among both citizens and elites. And then we will move on to comparing those, looking at the gap between citizens and elites. And then Jan will explain how we try to explain those gaps, and then will be another empirical part where I present these analyses. So the first data set that we used is obvious, as we are presenting in a webinar of the World Value Survey. We used World Value Survey round 7. And as Jan already explained, we used 5 countries that are diverse in various ways. And we matched with that an in-house elite survey that we did. So we used as much as possible, we used various questions that were formulated in the World Value Survey, and then we formulated them in exactly the same way in the elite survey so that they are directly comparable to each other. In order to do a study on international organizations that moved beyond the United Nations, we made sure that there were questions on those 5 additional international organizations in the World Value Survey, and then we also surveyed elites in those countries about it. The way in which we surveyed those elites was mostly by telephone. That was our privileged method, but in certain cases, those elites themselves wanted to do the survey by themselves online, and that was the case in 22% of the cases, and then we let them do so. In total, in those 6 countries combined, we surveyed 722 elites. Now, who are elites in our study? Elites, and I have to, move to the next slide, are on the one hand political elites, and on the other hand societal elites. A general definition for who functions or who figures as an elite in our survey is people who hold leading positions in key organizations in society that strive, there's a typo there, to be politically influential. So this means that we do not just interview elites that are part of global governance, that are active in international organizations. No, political and societal elites are people who, within their country, and also for their country on the international level, but not only, make policy decisions. On the one hand, political elites. Part of them, we have two groups. On the one hand, party political elites. So we have elected officials, but also high-ranking people working in their cabinets. And we have government bureaucracy. On the other hand, we have societal elites, where we have four sectors: business, civil society, media, and research elites. The way in which we sample these people is not by a random probability sample of an established population, because there is no list of who figures as political and societal elites in those 5 countries, 6 countries actually. And it is also not possible to compile this list. So what we did instead is we drew on advice that we solicited from people who are well known, who are experts of the different societies that we study, including our in-house experience with this, to first identify which ones are the relevant organizations in those different fields, politics and society. We also used accreditation lists, for instance, of international organizations for media. There we used not social media, but we looked at press, television, and radio broadcasts. So there we could also draw on audience numbers, for instance, to identify what the relevant organizations were. And then next, what we did was to look within those organizations who is working in a leading position in a substantive function. So not the head of HR, but managers, leading scholars, leading media reporters, and so on. So these categories, for that we used hard quota, which means that we wanted to have at least 25 party political elites, for instance, in each country. But we also had some soft quota because we wanted to have diversity in our sample. Diversity, we wanted to have in terms of 3 different criteria. On the one hand, orientation of people's work. So is their work based mostly on the subnational level, the national or the international level? We wanted to have variety on that to really reflect the country in a certain way. Then the policy issues that people mainly dealt with. Do they deal with environmental issues, economic issues, health issues, and so on? And then finally, for party politics, we wanted to make sure to cover the entire ideological spectrum in every country. But we wanted to sample a bit more people from the largest parties within the National Assembly in those countries. Then, once we know who we surveyed, what did we ask them? So we wanted to measure how legitimate they perceive various international organizations. And for that, we used the confidence question of the World Values Survey, and we extended that with 5 additional international organizations. So people were asked to rate each of these organizations individually on a 4-point scale, saying how much confidence they have in them. We use confidence as a proxy for legitimacy beliefs. This is a question that measures approval for an institution. It measures broad, diffuse support for an institution, so not specific support. So it really matches with what Jan described earlier as how we conceptualize legitimacy beliefs as a fundamental backing of an institution. An additional advantage of using this formulation is that it links with previous research about legitimacy in international and national organizations, because the confidence question has been used there before as well, so we can compare results. And then we move to the first figure with legitimacy beliefs and confidence that we observed in the data, and the first one is on citizens. What we observe here is, on the one hand, the third bar from the left, which is the average confidence if we group all different international organizations in our study. Then we have all international organizations separately, and we also have an additional bar with confidence in the government, the national government, because we wanted to have some point of reference there as well. The first thing that we see is that overall, if we look at the average confidence in international organizations, we could label this as modest skepticism. So there is little evidence for great enthusiasm, but also no outright rejection by the public. This suggests rather maybe a toleration of the status quo of the public at large, neither urging to expand international organizations, but also not to downscale global governance. But what we also see is when we break up the numbers between different international organizations, that actually for the World Health Organization, and all of this was before COVID when it became very, very visible, is that actually their confidence is leaning rather towards the quite a lot label on the scale. And confidence tends to be lower, especially on those economic international organizations, the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO. Then on the next slide, you see confidence in international organizations, both combined, separated, and confidence in the government by the elites in our sample. And what we immediately see is overall, they tend to have more confidence than citizens in those different organizations. So that already gives you a preview on the fact that we will observe a gap between citizens and elites in what they think about international organizations. It is also almost the same order that we find in terms of rating of international organizations. And also here, thus, we find that the economic IOs have lower confidence among elites than the other IOs in more human security type of issues. So this might be mirroring a critique that we have seen in the past few decades of neoliberalism by governments, media commentators, scholars, and so on. And then we move to a direct comparison between citizens and elites. So this picture presents the gap. So on the one hand, we see the gray bars of the bright gray bars, we see the elite numbers again. Then the dark gray bars, we see the citizen data that we saw before. And then in black is just is the difference between those two bars to make it very clear how large the gap is between those two. And the most important and the most general observation we have here is that elites tend to have more confidence in international organizations and citizens at large. And we see that for all the organizations that we looked at. So this is the data and also the previous figures of all the countries pooled every time. But we will also break it up by country later. This gap is important because it says something about, or it might have implications for global governance. Because if elites have more confidence in international organizations and citizens, it might become difficult for them to explain, to communicate what they are doing and why to citizens, because they are on a different line. Also, in terms of democratic representation, issues may arise. And when they make decisions, make agreements on the international level, they might face a backlash by citizens at large. Now, there is, of course, an important part in between, if you think about citizens, what they think themselves and what they do, especially if we think about those questions of democratic representation. And that is whether elites realize, actually, that citizens have less confidence in international organizations than they do. So that's why we also asked this question in the elite survey. And what we see overall, if we look at the IO's combined bar, the fourth bar from the left, then we see that generally elites realize that citizens at large have less confidence in international organizations than they do, but they still overestimate them. But then if we break it up again, we actually see that they are better at estimating citizen beliefs in some organizations than others. So they overestimate citizen confidence in the World Health Organization and the UN, for instance. They are almost correct for the International Criminal Court. They are close for the World Bank, close for the national government. But they actually even underestimate citizen confidence, especially in the IMF. That gap is quite big. So that is important because the realization that citizens want something else than elites at large is a prerequisite for them to make policy decisions that match well with the citizens that are affected by the decisions that are made on international organizations. But of course, what we don't know is whether they take this into account when they make decisions. That we couldn't survey. Then, as promised, we also broke up the elite citizen gap by country. And then again, we see quite a different picture. So here you see confidence in international organization combined, but we see it split up by country. And in the book, we also split it up by both organization and country, but we cannot present for 2 hours, right? A very striking observation here is the last bar for the Philippines. So this is the only country where we actually see the opposite. We see that elites tend to have less confidence in international organizations on average there than citizens at large. But as we do in the book, we break it up also by international organization. And then we see that this result is pulled by the economic organizations. There we see this picture. While for the International Criminal Court, the UN, and the World Health Organization, we see a similar pattern as overall in the other countries where elites have more confidence than citizens at large. We also see a large diversity between countries and how big the gap is. So it is clearly bigger in Brazil than in the US, Germany, for instance. And then another way in which we can break up the data is not by country, but by elite sector. And it also provides an interesting picture because we see that the gap is again very different in size if we look at different sectors. So here we grouped all the citizens of all countries and elites of all countries, and we look at average confidence in IOs. Again, in the book, we break it up even more by international organization. And what we see here is that the gap is much bigger for bureaucratic elites than civil society elites, where the gap is smallest. And generally, we can actually see that there is a difference between media, partisan, political, and societal elites, civic society elites, who have some kind of a linking and representative function of the larger population. And actually for them, their opinions about international organizations are more similar to those of the broader public than among bureaucrats, research, and business. And in business, with business elites, interestingly, we see that this gap is particularly large with economic organizations, because there we see that they rank them quite high in confidence compared to all other elites and citizens. So this was some insights, some descriptive information about confidence among citizens, elites, the gap, and looked at it from different angles. Now, we promised you that we also try to explain why we observe these gaps based on individual level explanations in our book. So Jan will first explain a bit more what our rationale is, and then I will provide the statistical results. Jan, over to you.
Okay. I'm just wondering whether Carlos or Tatiana or Christian, any questions or points you want to raise after hearing the sort of background. I don't know if you want to have a little bit of break for your questions and comments before we go on to the next part.
Yeah.
Carlos,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I won't have questions for now. Thank you.
Okay.
Carlos, yes, thank you.
Yes, I work in a similar topic. I'm part of the World Value Survey in South Africa with Henny
Okay.
Coffey. And we had some kind of survey similar in South Africa since the 20s. And we are also preparing another survey on elite. I will be in South Africa next June. So that's why I'm here, to see what's going on, how you do it. And we want to expand also to get back to the original conception of elite, not only parliamentary elite, but also media, trade unions, business, cultural elite, and so on. So I'm just now getting info to go back to South Africa in June and put everything together. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, good, thanks. Well, if you have specific questions, I think Sutkin led on the execution of the elite survey. So there are also many issues and struggles, I think, of actually doing it, getting the people to agree, having large teams of people on the phone, chasing them up, and so on and so forth. So at the execution level, I don't envy your task.
Yeah. We have also written specifically on that part a blog post for the International Affairs journal blog, which you might consult, and you can also contact me if there is something specific later on.
Thank you. I will. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a general question. Do you plan a repetition of this, or you don't plan a global replication of this study in several years' time?
This would be super valuable to do. I think we would love to. I mean, apart from the pain of actually doing the work, the intellectual and political benefit of doing such work, I think, is enormous. You probably noticed our data is from the late teens. We're now 6 years later, and of course, it would be very interesting to know how these figures look today. We were already surprised in the sense that even 6-7 years ago, the expectation was that, or many people, or if you were to read the newspaper and so on, you would think that citizens had no confidence at all, and multilateralism was going to collapse. And then it turned out that, as Sutkin was mentioning, the figures are they're not cheerleaders, but it's not the end of the world either. So would it be the case today? Would it be the case today that we think that everyone is wearing MAGA hats, but in fact it turns out that that's not so much the case? But in order to do that, we would have to execute it again, and it's a struggle to get the funds, to put a battery of questions, even of the ones that we did here. My recollection, it was something like 100,000 euros. Just to put the battery in of the six institutions. So you need to be able to find the funds to support that in order to be able to do a longitudinal study. I think it is an extremely valuable longitudinal study to do, and if not us, I'm sure there are plenty of people who would be keen to execute it, particularly given the atmosphere we have today.
Yeah. Currently, we're doing wave 8, so it's too late for wave 8, but we might think to look at funding for wave 9, which is about 3-4 years, when the Trump administration is hopefully finished, and then we can see the impact of Trump and others, and also the overall change of the whole debate. So we have some time to find the money in the next 3-4 years, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think I can say very, very strongly, not only Sutkin and I, but the whole team would completely embrace the possibility. We would love to see it done.
Okay, that's great. Okay, that's all from my side.
Good. Okay, then let's turn over to the explanatory side. It's fascinating to see the gap, to see it so consistently with some variation, but that the gap itself exists in almost every country, in relation to almost every, or in relation to all institutions, and in relation to all sectors of elites. I also found interesting that the gap in relation to national government and the gap in relation to international organizations is quite similar. Then that in fact the gap is although that also varies between countries. Okay, but how do we explain those variations that we see? Here, to set the broader context, when people try to explain legitimacy beliefs, they tend to take one of 3 general approaches. And I'm almost inclined to start with the organizational level, otherwise institutionalist arguments, if you like, where people say that, legitimacy beliefs are a function of, they're driven by, associate with people's perceptions of the institution in question. So legitimacy perceptions for the United Nations are related to the purpose of the United Nations, the procedures of the United Nations, the performance or outputs of the United Nations. So the idea is the institution has certain legitimacy beliefs, or attracts certain legitimacy beliefs, and that's driven by how that institution is set up and operates. And most work on legitimacy in global governance in international organizations is institutionalist in its explanations. And there's nothing wrong with that. And lots of studies have shown interesting relationships there. There are also studies and approaches which say, you can't look just at the organization. You have to look at the wider society in which that organization is operating. So look at the prevailing norms. If the prevailing norm is one of human rights, then appeals to human rights should increase legitimacy perceptions by the institution. If there's a US hegemony as an overall a world order of the time, then the degree to which the organization is conforming with and being part of a US hegemony would affect its legitimacy levels. Those are more societal level. Okay, we are actually looking at the individual level in this work and in this explanation. Legitimacy perceptions here are not a function of the institution that is being perceived, but are a function of characteristics of the perceiver. So it's the person, the people who are doing the perceiving look at variation in their individual characteristics, and that, so the hypothesis goes, should relate and drive, be associated with changes, variation in the legitimacy beliefs. So what does that mean in a little bit more detail? We look at individual level accounts. Why? Why would you look at individual level characteristics? Well, one reason might be that legitimacy is a belief in the mind of individuals. So it's always attached to individuals. And the idea is also that varying characteristics of those individuals would prompt them to think differently about the legitimacy of multilateral institutions. So if they're higher income or they're lower income, that should make them think differently, for example. We also think that if we look at elite individuals and citizen individuals, there might be systematic differences in the characteristics between elite individuals and citizen individuals that could account for the gap of their average legitimacy beliefs. Okay, none of this, of course, is to say that organizational level and societal level factors are not important. We could do other studies and the like, but in this study, we decided to focus on the individual level. And as you'll see from the results that come out shortly, it was interesting and important to do so. Oh yeah, and then we could just sell the story and say this is the first full-scale study that actually does this. But okay, that may be taken as given. All right, so 4 kinds of individual level factors that we focused on in particular. And these are individual level factors which are covered in various literature on legitimacy and governance. So we know that they've been shown in other contexts to be important. Here we're looking at how far they are important in relation to a variety of international organizations and how they are important for the gap between elites and citizens. You can see here one set of these variables is about socioeconomic status, so more material questions about level of education, level of income, satisfaction with household finances, and the like. Political values, people have suggested that the right wing or the left wing or the more liberal or the more conservative might have different attitudes systematically towards multilateral institutions. So let's see if that's true. Geographical identification is maybe a slightly obscure way of putting it, but what we mean here is people's attachment to certain spheres of society. So more nationally oriented, territorially oriented, state-oriented persons who identify their political attachments and political community in national terms, would they feel differently towards the legitimacy of international organizations than people who conceive of themselves as world citizens, cosmopolitan, and the like? Again, there's a prima facie case where you might think the more cosmopolitan would have more legitimacy beliefs towards the institutions or not, or maybe they're more critical, in which case they end up saying, oh, I wanted a much better United Nations than I've got, and in fact they do the opposite. Anyway, we wanted to see what would happen there. Lastly, domestic institutional trust. There's quite a bit of literature that suggests that people project their thoughts, their trust in national domestic governments and political systems onto the international level, and that they use their thoughts, their legitimacy beliefs to the national level as a heuristic for their feelings about the international organizations. So we also decided to have a look at that. I'm just thinking at the moment, if you remember, some of those national government levels were quite common to the international government levels, so that may be interesting too. Those then are the factors that we look at. Numbers time.
First.
Yeah, this summarizes why we might think there is a difference. But Zoot, can you take over?
Yes. So we want to explain the gap between citizens and elites, and we take an individual level approach in terms of theory. So we also do that in terms of methods. So what we do in the analyses is to try to see whether differences between citizens and elites in terms of socioeconomic status, political values, geographical identification, and domestic institutional trust, whether they can explain differences between citizens and elites in confidence in international organizations. So for that, we use what is called a dyadic modeling approach. So the numbers, to get at the unit of analysis, which are elite citizen diets, we matched every individual citizen with every individual elite in their country. And therefore, the dependent variable, for instance, is confidence in an international organization of an elite minus the confidence in an international organization of a citizen within a particular diet. So that means that as confidence for the citizens ranged between 0 and 3, and also for the elites it ranged between 0 and 3, this difference can range between -3 and 3. And we do the same thing with differences between elites and citizens in terms of the explanatory factors. And how does that look like? If we have the most general analysis that we can do, where we pool all countries and look at average confidence in international organizations, then we get this picture. We see that the data shows support for every line, all 4 lines of explanation for explaining differences between elites and citizens in terms of legitimacy beliefs. So how to interpret this, given a dyadic approach? This means that, for instance, if we look at the first result, education, so the more educated an elite is relative to a citizen in a diet, the more confidence they have in IOs relative to the citizen in that diet. For left-right orientation, we then see that more left, if the elite is more left-oriented than the citizen in the diet, the elite tends to have more confidence in the diet than the citizen, because the scale ranged from left to right, and we find a negative result. We find if an elite in a diet identifies as being green alternative liberal, and the citizen identifies as traditional authoritarian nationalist, then we find that the elite tends to have more confidence in international organizations than the citizen. We also find that elites who relatively to the citizen identify more with a global world community tend to have more confidence in international organizations. And we also find that if there is this difference of having more confidence in the government, then a citizen in a diet, the elite will also have more confidence in international organizations. Now again, as we did with the descriptives, we will break this up, first by international organization and then by country. In the book, again, we also break it up by international organization within each country. What we find, if we look at the analysis by international organization, but we keep on pooling the different countries, then we actually find that these results are consistent with what we saw on the previous slide, except for ideology. So this one seems to be linked to confidence in the human security, broadly speaking, area IO, so in the International Criminal Court, the UN, and the World Health Organization. But we do not find a significant association between political values and gaps in confidence in the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO. For the rest, we see a very similar pattern to the grouped results for all IOs together. If, however, we split up the analyses where we pool all the international organizations, but we break up the country samples, then we see something way more varied. What we do keep on seeing is that domestic institutional trust, in specific confidence in the government, is the most consistent finding, but interestingly not in the US. The other lines of explanation are significant each time in 3 different countries, but not all the same countries for each line of explanation. So for instance, we find socioeconomic status to matter to explain confidence in IOs in general in Brazil, the Philippines, and the US, but not in Germany and Russia. Also, interesting in this one is if we look at left-right orientation, we find it is significant in Germany, Russia, and the US. But in the US, there is a negative sign, while in Germany and Russia, there is a positive sign. So in Germany and Russia, if an elite is more right-wing oriented compared to the citizen in a diet, they tend to have more confidence in international organizations, while for the US, it's the other way around. We expect that this has something to do with the fact of how political parties, when they are put on the left-right spectrum, how they then position themselves. We checked in their party manifestos, how they position themselves towards international organizations, and that this then links to how the public also views international organizations in relation to what position they take themselves on the left-right position. So they mimic the party stances in those countries. That was a very quick, I am giving you an idea of the findings in our study. The book is open access, so you can find much more detail in there, breaking it up in many more ways. We give way more suggestions and explanations for differences that we find between international organizations and countries. But before we let you ask more questions or go on and read our book, Jan Aert will present some general conclusions that we draw from all of this.
Yeah, thanks. Just to recapitulate, because we've given you a lot of concepts and evidence and arguments and so on. I think if we look over the whole story, we can conclude legitimacy beliefs toward multilateral institutions are important. It's important to measure and explain them. That's what we've tried to do here. If you look overall at the levels of legitimacy beliefs towards the 6 key multilateral institutions across the 5 diverse countries, then the average confidence in those key multilateral institutions is medium-high among the elites and medium-low among the citizens at large. With an average, it's actually more 25%. Sorry, when you leave numbers to me, I start being sloppy. So I think it's actually 24.5%, the average difference between them. But anyway, it's significant. It's a lot. Those variations, when we look at to try and explain them, the individual level approach is validated. As you saw in the latest slides, many times individual level circumstances around socioeconomic status and political values, geographical identification, and domestic institutional trust, many times variation in those individual circumstances associate significantly with the elite citizen variations in legitimacy beliefs. So that means it is important to include the individual level in larger explanations of legitimacy beliefs. If you do only institutional level analyses or only societal level analyses, you are probably, if this study is anything to go by, you're missing a big part of the picture. And that means, institutions could do all kinds of institutional reforms. But if those institutional reforms don't address individual level circumstances, then, they can produce as many pamphlets as they like. It's not going to help. You need to understand the individual level. Okay. Wider implications of all of this? Well, I guess I just gave you one. I think this is our last slide, this, Sutkin. There we go. Yeah. So the implications of this, elites who are developing and executing global governance through multilateral institutions, whether they are national government elites or staff of the multilateral institutions themselves, they should know that they cannot count on citizens' unwavering support for them. And that might mean that they are constrained to be less ambitious in the global policies that they undertake. Maybe someone else says actually they should be more ambitious and then get people on board. But in any case, they can't count on the citizens. They can't just wake up the next morning and say, oh, once United Nations, forever United Nations. And I guess we are seeing some of that happen today. Citizen skepticism, that relatively low, medium low, that citizen lukewarmness, if we can call it that, towards existing multilateral institutions. That's the average. That means that there are a number of people under that average of medium low. And those circles are very possibly susceptible to populist politicians who want to play with anti-globalist discourses. And that seems to be manifested in much of the politics we see around us today. Turning to more normative sides, you could say that this gap, this elite citizen gap, is a normative problem in respect of democracy. If the elites don't recognize the gap, well, we see from that other slide that Sutkan showed earlier that they often perceive the gap and sometimes actually misread it, even exaggerate it. But as long as, to the extent that they don't recognize it, it's a problem. Or if they recognize it, but then don't adjust their behaviors and proceed with their own visions of international organizations rather than responding to the citizen skepticism, that can be a democratic problem. It could also be a practical problem in terms of if then citizens turn against the multilateral institutions. Yeah, and then there's democratic accountability. It's often said that multilateral institutions lack the conventional democratic accountability mechanisms that national governments do. If you have elite citizen problems within the national level, then you can have things happen in referenda and legislative elections and so on. And occasionally you can have a Brexit-like poll, I suppose, where the elite citizen gap can come out to the fore and have a very concrete result through democratic accountability mechanisms, in this case, the referendum. But in most cases, we don't have that. So if there aren't such arrangements, then citizen frustrations could build up and some political unrest vis-a-vis multilateral arrangements could arise. And in various occasions, we do actually see that manifested too. Anyway, just to say, very interesting, I hope for you, intellectual and academic exercise that we've done here. But I think it is one of those occasions where the academic research has important and significant political and policy implications.
Thank you very much. We are greeting now in the audience the National Director of the Weather Survey in Armenia and the National Director of the Weather Survey in Mongolia. So you can meet the real persons, the national leaders in the South Caucasus and in Central Asia. Okay, I think we have now a Q&A session. Yes, the head of the Secretariat, Xenia.
Thank you so much, Jan and Sutkin, for a very interesting presentation. I have two questions. One is perhaps more practical. One of the issues when we were fielding this module in Wave 7 of the World Value Survey was some skepticism from our principal investigators about how well the public actually knows this international organization. So some were concerned that we are asking about organizations that with whose work people are not so much familiar. And if you look at the distributions, you can see that, for example, in Brazil, so one of the countries that was included in your analysis, over 30% say they don't know if they actually trust the, for instance, International Monetary Fund or not. So my question is, how did you treat these respondents who could not express clearly their opinion? Were they completely excluded from the analysis, or was there any possibility to somehow find out what is hiding behind these don't knows. And my second question was about political trust in domestic institutions. I believe in one of the regressions it was shown a positive correlation. So to which extent predictors of political trust in domestic institutions also explain trust in international organizations? Is there any kind of common set of features that contributes to greater political trust in principle, both at national level and international level? Thank you.
Maybe you can handle, if I just say preliminarily, Ksenia, thanks for those questions, really good. We did have some knowledge questions, general knowledge questions about the international organizations as well. Which country is not a member of the Security Council, where are the headquarters of the IMF located, and so on. So as a backdrop to evaluate how much do people know about. And I mean, Sutkin, you'll have the specific outcomes, I think, there. But I think we were struck at how well people actually did know. At least it was much higher than my. So the skepticism from your PIs, I think, might have been countered a little bit at that level. There are, as you say, Brazil 30% on the IMF, which actually surprises me given how much the IMF has intervened in Brazil historically. But anyway, that's another matter. But on the whole, I think we were, and I've done several other studies outside of this particular one where we've also done knowledge questions, and again, it's come up quite strikingly, surprisingly. Now, how deep the knowledge of the IMF is beyond knowing that it's in Washington, D.C., okay, that may be a question. But the idea that people have never heard of these organizations and don't have any inkling of what they do, that was happily, in my case, I've counted a little bit. But in terms of how we handled this statistically, I think Sutkin's much better placed.
Yeah. Well, when people said they don't know an international organization and they don't say how much confidence they have, then we cannot analyze their confidence. So they were dropped from the analysis if they didn't produce an opinion in the survey. And we were actually happy to see that there was overall 15%, but then in certain countries a bit more. People who said don't know to those countries, because that actually gives us confidence in data quality, that they felt confident indicating that they don't know, rather than producing an opinion that they actually don't hold on the spot just for the survey. What we also did is we used the knowledge questions on international organizations, which we also specifically entered for this in the World Values Survey, to check the robustness of our findings if we would take this into account. And our findings were robust for that. So there were no issues that we could spot based on people's limited knowledge of international organizations that would drive any of the results, that we would see a real bias there. Then I understood your question on trust in domestic institutions and confidence in international organizations as whether there is a common antecedent to both types of trust. So that was not part of our study. At some other point, Lisa, Jonas, and maybe also Jan, or was it only Lisa and Jonas? Anyway, from the research team, did some research where they showed that, well, actually, this is also associated with generalized trust, where they make an argument that generalized trust might be an antecedent for trust in institutions. Yeah, so that would be their answer to your question.
Yeah. Thank you. We have a scholar in our audience from the Philippines, Dr. Yu. She was very interested to hear your research about Philippines because this is very relevant for her own work. Okay. But I think, Dr. Yu, if you want to contact the team, our secretariat can link you if you have further questions about the research on Philippines. Okay, we are 2 minutes after the finish, but we still have last minute for final statements, remarks, questions, recommendations. I think it was very clear. Scandinavian, Dutch clarity, almost left no questions to be asked. And we can always go back to the book and enjoy the book. And this webinar is recorded and will be published on the YouTube channel of the WVS survey. So you will become influencers and film stars on YouTube. And you can watch yourself again and again and send it to your family how famous you are and how popular you are. So we have a YouTube channel where we document all our webinars.
Good to know. Thank you.
But see, is very careful to take out my jokes, but your presentations are complete in the YouTube channel. Okay, are there any final questions from the audience? Let's look at the chat. Are there in the chat there was one? Ah, it was Philippines. Okay. Okay, this is not the case. Then we started in time and we finished in time. Thank you very much, Jan and Sotkin, and congratulations. And Professor Hegene from Armenia thanks you for the interesting presentation, and also Dr. Yu. So everybody is pleased about it. And that's it. And the webinar is every month. So same time, same station, same YouTube channel if you are interested. Okay, thank you very much. Congratulations.
Thank you for the opportunity to present a short synopsis of our book. And we hope that, we will have some additional readers. And if anyone has questions, you can always email us. Yeah.
Yes, please contact the team. They're ready to help you. Do we have also a blog about this or just a short abstract? A blog? Do we have a blog?
Well, we have a blog post on specifically the background story of collecting elite survey data on the blog of International Affairs. That's where people can find this one.
Yeah, okay. We did have a blog on the Legitimacy and Global Governance program, but that was a blog on multilateralism in general and not specific to this elite citizen gap.
Yeah. Dr. Yu is asking if it's possible to share the link to the blog with the audience. So maybe you'll send it to the secretariat and then she can share it with the audience.
Yeah, I think if you type in Legitimacy in Global Governance Stockholm, it will take you there.
Okay, this will be a good test of your literacy in internet if you find this blog. Okay. Thank you very much, and congratulations on the book and on the research, and let's stay in touch. Maybe in wave 9 we can do something together again to have replication pre-Trump and post-Trump.
Yeah, the world will change or not. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Xenia, as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.